students. Today we discuss the last part of first year, that we call it as Man and Biosphere. It is a very important topic from the first year, Man and Biosphere. In the main EAMCET examination, from this topic generally we are getting 4 bits. In the Man and Biosphere, one is the introductory part, the second one is light, the third one is temperature, water, biotic factors, ecological pyramids, types of food chains, population ecology, and some miscellaneous parts, and the last one is biodiversity. Again it is repeating. Regarding main EAMCET point of view, this is very important topic, and at the same time it is completely a by-hearting topic. From this topic we are getting minimum 4 marks questions. One question definitely coming from biodiversity, and remaining 3 bits coming from the rest of the part of Man and Biosphere. Generally in the Man and Biosphere we have to discuss the introductory part, light, temperature, water, biotic factors, and what are the functions of ecosystem, population ecology, lake ecosystem, etc. As usual, while we are discussing the questions, concerned with each and every question, we have to discuss some important points. Before going to the bits, a small introduction regarding the Man and Biosphere. For a long period, it was strongly believed that the man is the biosphere, biosphere is the man. But according to the recent investigations, the man came to conclusion that he is the only part of biosphere. The existence of man in the biosphere depends on the existence of other living organisms. Without other living organisms, there is no existence of man in the biosphere. Now as we observe the introductory part of Man and Biosphere, we are having a small idea regarding the solar system. In the solar system, the main head is said to be the sun. In association with the sun, 9 planets are present, and each one is present in its own orbit. Out of these planets, name the planet on which the life is present, that we call it as the Earth. As we observe the Earth is broadly classified into 3 components. One we call it as atmosphere, and the second one we call it as hydrosphere, and the third one we call it as lithosphere. Again this point is repeating. The Earth is broadly classified into 3 physical components. One we call it as atmosphere, second one we call it as hydrosphere, and the third one we call it as lithosphere. Now we enter into the questions. Now we have to observe the first question. While discussing the each and every question related to that question, we have to discuss what are the important points. Now, what is the first question? The study of interrelationships between different species of organisms is called. Now as we observe the introductory part of Man and Biosphere, one we call it as ecology. What is meant by ecology? It is the study of relationships between the living organisms and surrounding environment. That we call it as ecology. The word ecology proposed by Ernest Haeckel. The word ecology proposed by Ernest Haeckel. Now the ecology is broadly classified into 2 categories. One we call it as articology, the second one we call it as synecology. What is meant by articology? The relation between the living organisms of one species and surrounding environment. Again repeating, the relations between the living organisms of one species and surrounding environment, that we call it as articology. The relations between the living organisms of different species and surrounding environment, that we call it as synecology. Different species synecology, one species articology. These two are the branches of ecology. The word ecology proposed by Ernest Haeckel. Ecology word is derived from two Greek words. One we call it as oikos and the second one we call it as logos. What is meant by logos? That is the study. What is meant by oikos? That is house. Here what is the house? The surrounding environment. And now, as we observe the first question, the study of interrelationships between different species of organisms is called, one we call it as articology. What is meant by articology? The relations between the living organisms of one species and surrounding environment. Second one, synecology. Relations between the organisms of different species and surrounding environment. That we call it as synecology. What is the other name of synecology? That we call it as ecology of communities. So for the first question, what is the correct answer? The second and the third options both are correct. Now we go for the next question. Now, the average atmospheric pressure on the earth surface. Now as we observe the atmosphere, the earth is broadly classified into three physical components. One we call it as atmosphere. What is meant by atmosphere? The gaseous envelope covering the earth, that we call it as the atmosphere. Now as we observe this one, we call it as the earth surface. Now this is called earth surface ES. The gaseous envelope covering the earth, that we call it as atmosphere. In the atmosphere, one we call it as the troposphere. And the second one we call it as the stratosphere. And the third one we call it as ionosphere. And the last one we call it as exosphere. Now here what is the question? What is the average atmospheric pressure on earth surface? On earth surface, what is the average atmospheric pressure? 1 atmosphere. It is also called 1014 millibars. On earth surface, what is the average atmospheric pressure? That is 1 atmosphere. 1 atmosphere is nothing but 1014 millibars. Now here, what is the first answer? 1041 millibars, 1014 millibars, 1014 atmosphere and 1 millibar. The correct answer is 1 atmosphere, or in other words 1014 millibars. Now we go for the next question. Assertion. Troposphere is the denser and the most turbulent layer of the atmosphere. Again repeating. Troposphere is denser and most turbulent layer of the atmosphere. The reason is, most of the atmospheric phenomena occur in the troposphere. Now this one we call it as earth surface, and this is one layer of atmosphere that we call it as the troposphere. At poles, at equator, what is the thickness of troposphere? 8 to 10 kilometers, 16 to 18 kilometers. The living organisms are present between earth surface and troposphere. Most of the oxygen present in the troposphere. In the troposphere, as the height increases, the oxygen decreases. Now, the almost all the air mass present in the troposphere, so that it is the most turbulent layer. Now here the assertion. Troposphere is the densest and most turbulent layer of the atmosphere, because most of the atmospheric phenomena, almost all components of atmosphere are present in the troposphere. So A and R are correct. R explains the A. Now we go for the next question. Choose the incorrect statements from the following about atmosphere. This one we call it as atmosphere, troposphere, stratosphere, ionosphere and exosphere. Now here what is the question? Choose the incorrect statement from the following about atmosphere. Now what is the first statement? Percentage of composition of gases in the atmosphere is same at all altitudes. Again repeating, the percentage of composition of various gases is same at all altitudes, but the partial pressure changes with altitude. That is the correct statement, because irrespective of altitudes the percentage is always the constant. What about the second one? Temperature at tropopause is 57 degrees. Now as we observe this one, we call it as the troposphere. Where the troposphere ends, that we call it as tropopause. The place where troposphere ends, that we call it as tropopause. At tropopause, what is the temperature? Minus 57 degrees centigrade, but not 57 degrees centigrade. So the second statement is wrong. Now third one, in stratosphere, now this is the second layer. In stratosphere, temperature increases with altitude. With the altitude, with reference to altitude, in the stratosphere the temperature increases. That is also the correct. What about the fourth statement? In mesosphere, now this one we call it as the ionosphere. In the ionosphere, two layers are present. One we call it as mesosphere, the second one we call it as the thermosphere. Here what is asking the statement regarding the mesosphere? Here the fourth one. In the mesosphere, temperature increases with altitude. No. In mesosphere, as altitude increases, the temperature decreases. So here out of the four statements, irrespective of the altitudes, the percentage of gases is the constant. The first statement is correct. What about the second statement? At tropopause, the temperature is minus 57 degrees centigrade, but not 57. So the second statement is wrong. What about the third statement? In the stratosphere, the temperature increases with altitude. And whereas in the fourth statement, one part of ionosphere that we call it as mesosphere. In mesosphere, here what they gave? In mesosphere, temperature increases with altitude. No, temperature decreases with altitude. So regarding this question, the second statement and the fourth statement are incorrect. Now we go for the next question. Again a assertion. Ionosphere helps making telecommunications possible over long distances. Now again repeating. Ionosphere helps making telecommunications possible over long distances. A reason. In ionosphere, the ions and free electrons exist in sufficient quantities to reflect short radio waves. Now, what is the third layer of atmosphere that we call it as ionosphere? At equator as well as at poles. What is the thickness of ionosphere? Near about 500 kilometers. As we observe the ionosphere, in the ionosphere, the oxygen and next nitrogen and nitric oxide, all these are in the ionic state. Why the oxygen, nitrogen, nitric oxide are in the ionic state in the ionosphere? Because of ionizing radiation. Because of the ionizing radiation in the ionosphere, the oxygen, nitrogen and nitric oxide are in the ionic state. They reflect the short radio waves. Because of this process, the ionosphere play an important role. Possibility of telecommunications between distant places. Now based on this information, here A and R are correct. R explains A. Now we go for the next question. The uppermost mantle along with the crust forms the lithosphere which cools by. Now as we observe the physical components of earth, one we call it as atmosphere, second one hydrosphere, third one lithosphere. Now this one we call it as lithosphere. In the lithosphere, the first one we call it as crust, and the second one we call it as mantle, and the third one we call it as the core. Now as we observe the crust, it is covered by the soil. What about the mantle? It is in the form of the rocks. What about the core? It is classified into this is outer core and this is inner core. Here, what is the question? The uppermost mantle along with the crust. This is uppermost layer of the mantle. Uppermost layer of the mantle along with the crust. Now that part we call it as the lithosphere. The lithosphere is formed by a process called conduction. What is meant by lithosphere? The uppermost layer of the mantle plus crust combinedly termed as lithosphere. How it is formed by a process called conduction. Now here, what is the first option? Convection or convention. The second one is compaction. The third one is conduction. And the fourth one is capacitation. Now the lithosphere is formed by a process called conduction. Now the next question. The region of mantle extending below lithosphere that cools by convection. Now here, this one we call it as mantle. The upper layers of mantle in association with the crust, we call it as lithosphere. The lithosphere is formed by a process called the conduction, we already discussed. And lithosphere is followed by the part of mantle follows the lithosphere, that we call it as asthenosphere. Asthenosphere is formed by a process called convection. Lithosphere is formed by conduction. Asthenosphere is formed by convection. The lithosphere followed by asthenosphere, or part of mantle follows lithosphere, that we call it as asthenosphere. It is also in the cool condition. It is formed by a process called the convection. In the previous question, lithosphere is formed by conduction. Now, we go for the next question. Molten iron and nickel. Here the meaning of the question. Iron and nickel are in the molten state. The molten iron and nickel is found in which of the geological layers of earth? Now, as we observe the lithosphere, this one we call it as crust, mantle, core. The core is classified into outer core and inner core. Now as we observe the outer core, the temperature of outer core is 4000 degrees centigrade. What about the inner core? 6300 degrees centigrade. In the outer core, the materials are in the molten state, whereas in the inner core, the materials are in the crystalline state. Now here, We have to observe the question once again. Iron and nickel are in the molten state found in which of the layers of the earth? One is outer core, outer mantle and inner mantle. Here the correct answer is the outer core. What about the inner core? The materials are in the crystalline state. Now we go for the next question. Arrange the following in a correct order, or arrange the following in a correct hierarchy from lower to higher level. First we have to observe what are the options given. One is ecosystem, second one is ecosphere, third one is organism, fourth one is biotic community, and the fifth one we call it as population. Now this question is related to the introductory part of Man and Biosphere. Now as we observe, this one we call it as the organism. A group of organisms belonging to one species. The species is in the form of population. Now this one we call it as population. Individuals of one species, or the species is in the form of population. Now assemblage of different populations, we call it as biotic community. Assemblage of different communities, we call it as ecosystems. Assemblage of different ecosystems, we call it as the biosphere. What is the other name of biosphere? That is ecosphere. Individuals of one species belonging to, or individuals of one species live in a particular area at a particular time, share common gene pool, can interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. That we call it as a species. And the species is in the form of population. Assemblage of populations, a community, biological community. What is one example for the biological community or biotic community? Woodland community. Assemblage of communities, one ecosystem. Assemblage of ecosystems, that we call it as biosphere. What is the other name of biosphere? That is ecosphere. Now based on this information, we have to arrange the options in a order, that means in a ascending order. One is the organism. Now the second one we call it as population, then biotic community, then ecosystem, and finally ecosphere or biosphere. Now the answer is the first one. Now we move for the next question. We go for the next question. Before going to the next question, find the incorrect statement from the following. Find the incorrect statement. Now the first statement, temperature and rainfall are the most important factors which determine the climate of an area. Now as we observe the climate, what is meant by climate? It is an assemblage of temperature. It is an assemblage of temperature, light, and next humidity, rainfall, etc. All these are combinedly termed as climate. Now what are the factors influence the climate? Climate is nothing but the temperature. It is the light, it is the rainfall, it is the humidity, etc. All these are termed as the climate. The climate present immediate to the body of an organism. This is the body of one organism. Around the body of an organism, the climate is present. The climate immediate to the body of an organism, that we call it as microclimate. What is meant by climate? It is the assemblage of light, temperature, and next humidity, rainfall, all these commonly termed as climate. Such climate is influenced by one factor is the temperature and the second one is the rainfall. So the first statement is correct. And now the second one is an ecosystem is not a self-sustained unit. Now it is wrong. As we observe the ecosystem, whatever it may be ecosystem, whether it is terrestrial or freshwater or marine water or brackish water ecosystem, every ecosystem is a self-sustained or self-supporting. But here what is the second statement? It is not a self-sustained. It is the wrong. The term ecosystem is proposed by the Tansale. What about the third statement? Organism is the basic unit of study in the ecology. What is meant by ecology? It is the relation between the living organisms. It is the relation between the living organisms and surrounding environment. So in order to explain the ecology, what is the basic unit? Nothing but the organism. So the third statement is correct. What about the fourth statement? Landscape is a mosaic of ecosystems surrounded by natural boundaries. Now, what is meant by landscape? Assemblage of ecosystems. Take for example India, that is a natural ecosystem. The India has the natural boundaries. One is Himalayas, the second one is Hindu Mahasamudram, the third one is Bangalakatam, and the fourth one is Arabia Mahasamudram. That means India is an ecosystem. It is a naturally formed ecosystem and it has natural boundaries. The assemblage of such ecosystems with natural boundaries, that we call it as a landscape. So that regarding this question, in the given four statements, only the second one is wrong. That is, an ecosystem is not a self-sustained. It is a self-sustained, but not a self-sustained. So here the incorrect one is second. Now we go for the next question. A biotic community in a large area living in a particular climatic conditions. It is a repeated question. A biotic community, no doubt it is a community in a large area living in a particular climatic conditions, that we call it as biome. What is meant by biome? It is an area having particular climatic conditions. One example we call it as tundras. One example we call it as tundras. Tundra, it is an area. In the tundras, no plants are present. In tundras, during summer season, 24 hours light available. In the winter season, it is completely in the frozen state. What is the second example? Coniferous forest. Now, it is an area. In this area, what type of plants are predominant or dominant? Coniferous. Now, how the biome is named? Biome is an area in which what type of organisms are dominant. Based on that, it is named. Take for example tundra. Tundra is a biome. In the tundra, plants are totally absent. Absence of plant is a dominant character. So, it is named as tundra. What about the coniferous forest? It is an area in which so many plants are present, but the coniferous plants are predominant. So, it is named as coniferous forest area or taiga. And the third example we call it as grassland. Now, grassland, it is also a biome. It is an area in which what are predominant? The grass is predominant. So, this biome is called the grass. So, biome is an area having a particular climatic conditions. Now, here the question. A biotic community in a large area living in a particular climatic conditions constitutes. The correct answer is the biome. Now, we go for the next question. The term ecosystem. As we observe the ecosystem, the word ecosystem is coined by the Tansale. As we observe the ecosystem, in the ecosystem, the biotic factors and abiotic factors are present. What are the biotic factors? One we call it as producers, consumers and decomposers. What are the consumers? Primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. And all these are the biotic factors. In the biotic factors body, what is present? The life is present. What about the abiotic factors? They are classified into physical abiotic factors and chemical abiotic factors. What are the physical abiotic factors? One we call it as light, and the second one we call it as temperature, and the third one we call it as water, and the fourth one we call it as geomagnetism. And all these are the physical abiotic factors. What are the chemical abiotic factors? One is acidity, and the second one we call it as alkalinity, and the third one we call it as inorganic nutrients. As we observe the physical and chemical abiotic factors, there is an inseparable association. As we observe the biotic and abiotic, again there is an inseparable association. So that one ecosystem having these components. Now such word ecosystem is coined by the Tansel. Now we go for the next question. Now match the following and choose the correct answer. Now as we observe the list 1, now you have to observe the question. List 1 or part 1. One we call it as the troposphere. The second one we call it as the stratosphere. And the third one we call it as ionosphere. And the fourth one we call it as exosphere. And now we are having one idea regarding the layers of atmosphere. What is the innermost layer? That we call it as the troposphere. Where it ends, that we call it as the tropopause. What about the stratosphere? In the stratosphere, what is present? O3, ozone. The stratosphere is called ozone umbrella. It protects the living organisms against the strong intensity of UV rays. Above stratosphere, what is present? The ionosphere. It is classified into mesosphere and thermosphere. Above ionosphere, what is present? Exosphere. If we cross exosphere, that we call it as the space. Now this is a small information regarding the layers of atmosphere. Now we go for the part 2. Now the first option, telecommunications. Now as we observe the ionosphere, in the ionosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the nitric oxide are in the ionic state because of the ionizing radiation. Because of the ionizing radiation, they reflect short radio waves. So the ionosphere responsible for the telecommunications between distant places. So that the telecommunications is associated with ionosphere. Second one, extremely low air pressure. As we observe the exosphere, above exosphere, the pressure is very less. So that the extremely low air pressure is associated with the exosphere. 75% of mass of atmosphere. Now this one we call it as the troposphere. In the troposphere, almost all air mass present in the troposphere. So that 75% of the mass of atmosphere is related to the troposphere. What is the fourth one? Ozone rich layer. That we call it as the stratosphere. According to the satellite photographic information, as we observe the Antarctica region, in the Antarctica region the ozone layer is depleted. What is meant by depletion of ozone layer? In the Antarctica region, the ozone is converted into O2. The depletion of ozone is nothing but the ozone holes. So that in the Antarctica region, one country is Australia. In the Australia, in the rural areas, the skin of human beings is directly exposed to the strong intensity of UV radiation. So that in Australia, in the rural areas, many people have been suffering from the skin cancer because there The skin is directly exposed to the strong intensity of UV rays because in that area the ozone depleted. What is meant by depletion of ozone? There the O3 is converted into O2. Based on this information, what is the correct answer? That is the first option. Now we go for the next question. Now, the region of lithosphere with 2900 kilometers thickness. Now as we observe the lithosphere, one physical component of earth we call it as the lithosphere. Generally, the lithosphere is classified into one we call it as crust, and the second one we call it as the mantle, and the third one we call it as the core. Now as we observe the mantle, what is the thickness of mantle? That is 2900 kilometers. Now this is outer part of mantle. Now this is inner part of the mantle. In the outer part of mantle, what is the temperature? 100 degrees centigrade. In the inner parts of mantle, what is the temperature? 4000 degrees centigrade. The mantle is in the form of the rocks. The outermost part of mantle with crust, that we call it as lithosphere, already discussed. Below lithosphere, the next part of mantle we call it as asthenosphere, that is also discussed in the previous question. Now, based on this information, the region of lithosphere with 2900 kilometers thickness and hard rocks rich in iron and magnesium, that we call it as mantle. Now we go for the next question. Now as we observe the next question, select the correct sequence regarding the levels of organization. Now as we observe the hierarchy, the first one we call it as the cell. The cells are united to form the tissues. The tissues are united to form organs. The organs are united to form the organ systems. The organ systems are united to form one organism. Now, the organisms, that we call it as the population. Assemblage of different populations we call it as a biotic community. Assemblage of different communities we call it as ecosystem. Assemblage of different ecosystems, that we call it as ecosphere or biosphere. That means as we observe the kingdom Animalia, in the kingdom Animalia all are multicellular. The body is made by many cells. The cells are united to form the tissues. What is the hallmark in the body organization? That is the tissues. What is meant by hallmark? Important character. The tissues in the form of organs. The organs, organ systems become one organism, and organisms of one species in the form of population. The populations, assemblage of different populations, community. Assemblage of different communities, one ecosystem. Assemblage of different ecosystems, that we call it as one ecosphere or biosphere. Now, based on this information, what is the correct hierarchy? The last one. Cells, they are in the form of tissues, they are in the form of organisms, they are in the form of populations, they are in the form of communities, they are in the form of ecosystems. Finally, all ecosystems termed as biosphere or ecosphere. Now we go for the next question. Which of the following protein is to be essential present for the animals to exhibit bioluminescence? Now, as we observe the bioluminescence, what is meant by bioluminescence? To emit light. What is meant by bioluminescence? To emit light. Bioluminescent organisms are more in the marine water. Bioluminescent organisms are more in the marine water. So, during the night time, as we observe the sea water, or the oceanic water or any marine water, during the night time the marine water dazzles. Why the marine water dazzles? Because majority of bioluminescent organisms are present in the marine water. One or two examples are present in the fresh water. That is not a criteria. Those organisms emit light in their body. What type of protein is present? That we call it as luciferin. Now, the luciferin undergoes what type of chemical reaction? Oxidation. Now here, what is the catalyst? That we call it as luciferase. Here, luciferase is an enzyme. Luciferin is a protein. What is the chemical reaction? That we call it as the oxidation. Now, the reactants participate in this reaction. What are the total photoreactants? 6. In the 6 reactants, what is the important protein? The luciferin. After completing the chemical reaction, the main end product is the cold light. Because of the bioluminescence, the organisms release what type of light? Cold light. Why the light here is cold? Because here what type of rays are absent? Infrared rays are absent. But as we observe every day, the sun releases radiant energy. In the radiant energy, infrared rays are present. So the radiant energy is very, very hot. But the light produced by bioluminescence process is cold. Because in the cold light, what is absent? The infrared rays. Now, here the question is, which of the following protein is said to be essential, present for the animals to exhibit bioluminescence? That is luciferin. What are the examples for the bioluminescent organisms? One we call it as jellyfishes. The second one we call it as squid. The third one we call it as Chaetopterus. The fourth one we call it as Noctiluca. The next one we call it as Serratium. And the next one we call it as Pyrosoma. All these are the examples for this process. Again, examples are repeating. One is the jellyfishes. The second one is the squids. And the third one is the Chaetopterus. And the fourth one we call it as Noctiluca. And the next one we call it as Serratium, Pyrosoma. What is the organism exhibiting highest degree of bioluminescence? That is Pyrosoma. Now we go for the next question. Cave-dwelling animals. Now as we observe the biological effects of light on living organisms, one we call it as the pigmentation. One we call it as the pigmentation. What is the significance of pigmentation? That we call it as the protection. Now as we observe the body of living organisms, our body is covered and protected by skin. Our skin has a dark pigmentation. As we observe the organisms live in tropical countries. What are the tropical countries? They are very close to equator. One example is India. One example is Pakistan. One example is South Africa. One is West Indies. One is Cuba. All these are the tropical countries. The tropical countries are very, very, very close to the equator. The organisms live in the tropical countries are continuously exposed to the strong intensity of light. In order to get protection from the strong intensity of light, in our body the skin has pigmentation. What is the main function of pigmentation? That we call it as protection. But here, what is the question? In cave-dwelling animals, one example we call it as the proteus. What is meant by proteus? It is a blind amphibian. Why it is blind? Because the proteus lives in the caves. the cave dwelling animals are not exposed to the light intensity. So in the cave dwelling animals, the pigmentation and the rate of metabolism in cave dwelling animals, the pigmentation is less and the metabolism is also low. Now again we are repeating, as we observe the biological effects of light on living organisms. One, we have to discuss the pigmentation. Second, the effect of light on the locomotion, the effect of light on vision, and the effect of light on metabolism, and the biological rhythms, and the vision, and the UV rays, and the bioluminescence. All are discussed under the biological effects of light on living organisms. Here we discuss the pigmentation. Now we go for the next question.